Alrighty then. Good afternoon to you all. This is now episode 6, which means that we are halfway through, at least halfway through my planned number of sessions, that is 12. Today's going to be interesting. I think I have some stuff that y'all will find interesting. I hope. This is entitled Questions That Need Answering, because we're kind of moving towards a hopefully more fulsome discussion of persecution of the early church and early Christian martyrdom. We've been talking about martyrdom, the martyrdom of Polycarp, Ignatius, other references to martyrdom that we've seen in the Apostolic Fathers. But we've mostly been looking at that issue from the Christian perspective that we have in these early Christian texts. And we've been a little bit less concerned with the actual sort of historical realities that provided the context for those writings. So we're kind of moving towards thinking about that historical reality a little bit more. And so today I'm going to discuss the Epistle to Diognetus and talk about some of the questions that raises for us as we think about early Christian martyrdom and persecution in the Roman Empire. But before we do that, let's review. So last time, we talked about the martyrdom of Polycarp. Polycarp, of course, his name sounds like a Pokemon. I don't think I mentioned that last time. I just want to call that out. His name sounds like he is a Pokemon. He is not a Pokemon. He is a guy. Polycarp, his name means much fruit in Greek. Polycarpos. But he supposedly had contact with the Apostle John. So he's kind of this transitional figure between the apostolic era and sort of the rest of the patristic period. And he died in approximately 155 CE. And it is the account of his martyrdom that we looked at. We talked about how the martyrdom of Polycarp is one of the oldest independent Christian martyrdom texts that we have. That is, it's one of the oldest examples of sort of a standalone story of a particular martyrdom. We also talked about how the martyrdom of Polycarp is sort of a blend of genres. It takes a lot of influence from Jewish martyrdom texts, so think the book of Maccabees. But it is in that sort of uniquely Christian genre of the letter. It is epistolary, meaning that it has sort of an introduction like a letter, but it's a letter that tells a story. So it's kind of this interesting sort of uniquely Christian blend of things. And this story also gained wide acceptance in the early church, meaning that not only was Polycarp himself a very influential bishop in the early church, but the story of his martyrdom was very influential as well. We also looked at some basic figures, and this will come into play a little bit today. Some basic figures for just how many Christians there were in the Roman Empire at this time. So I took this from Rodney Stark's Rise of Christianity. He sort of presents an estimate of an increase in the Christian population of the Roman Empire of about 40% per decade. And so if you look at, 150, that's kind of smack dab in the middle of the period that is sort of most associated with the Apostolic Fathers. You have about 40,000 Christians or so. So I'll come back to this a little bit later, because this figure here, around 50 to 60, approximately 2,000 Christians, that will come into play as well. But just we were kind of getting a sense of the scale of persecution in the Roman Empire. We'll have a little bit more to say about that, especially next time, but perhaps just keep that in mind. But our main focus was the fact that this story of Polycarp's martyrdom was intended to present an example of martyrdom, quote unquote, in accordance with the gospel. And so Polycarp was presented as an example of faithful suffering, and an example of martyrdom that they saw at the time of being sort of in accordance with, in step with the gospel, both in terms of imitating Jesus, that is, imitating the gospel stories and the things that actually happened to Jesus in his crucifixion, but also in accordance with the gospel, following along in the path of Jesus in a way that the gospel teaches. So kind of that double meaning of that idea. Polycarp by this time was an older man, so we kind of looked at these sort of famous sayings. 86 years I have served him. How can I blaspheme my king? Sort of very stirring, emotional words from Polycarp. And our conclusion was that the martyrdom of Polycarp presents the Roman judicial system as being arbitrary, unjust, and unusual. So the normal procedure for a trial was not followed. But also, in the face of this sort of arbitrary injustice, Polycarp is an example of imitating Christ. And there's also this idea that martyrdom should not be sought. We noted that in the letters of Ignatius, going to his martyrdom sort of knowingly, is writing about his thoughts on the matter. And he keeps saying to the Christians in Rome, for example, don't prevent me from being martyred. Let me die for Christ. Let me imitate Christ. And you almost get the sense that he wants this to happen, that he's really excited about martyrdom. And I think there's kind of a couple different ways you could read Ignatius's words. But in the martyrdom of Polycarp, there's a definite sense that martyrdom should not be sought. So even though Polycarp is facing martyrdom bravely and faithfully, martyrdom is not something that should be chased after or sought after. And so, all in all, the martyrdom in accordance with the gospel is this idea that the gospel both teaches us how to imitate Christ in terms of kind of imitating him specifically, but also is sort of, I guess, a manual for how to witness to the truth of the Christian faith in the midst of opposition. So all of that was the martyrdom of Polycarp. And now we turn to a document that is interesting. The Apostolic Fathers are already kind of a strange collection of texts, and the Epistle to Diognetus is no exception. As with many of the texts that we are discussing in this course, the Epistle to Diognetus is dated to the mid to late 2nd century. And it is also a letter. It is an epistle. And it's written from an unnamed author to someone named Diognetus. The name Diognetus means born of God. And so there's been some suggestions, and this is kind of a similar situation to Theophilus with Luke Acts, both of those documents addressed to someone named Theophilus. And Theophilus means one who loves God. And so there's some question, are these actual people? Are these names, one who loves God and the one born of God, are these just sort of stand-ins, fill-ins for a generic seeker of some kind? With Theophilus, the case seems to be that he was probably an actual person, but with Diognetus, it's even harder to tell since there's sort of even less context for what's going on. But the beginning of the letter basically sums up its content quite succinctly. It says that, "Since I perceive, most excellent Diognetus, that you are very eager to learn the religion of the Christians, both what God they trust and how they worship him, so that they all both disregard the world and despise death, and they consider neither those supposed by the Greeks to be gods, nor do they observe the superstition of the Jews, and what is the deep affection they have for one another. So this letter is written to someone who is apparently inquiring about the Christian faith. And so this is an early example of what we might call apologetics. That is, providing some sort of explanation and rationale for the actions of Christians and what they believe. So the author of this letter is responding to the inquisitive Diognetus. And so outlined here, you can basically see what arguments this author is going to make. So Diognetus has been inquiring about the religion of the Christians. And so the author here is going to provide some sort of explanation for why Christians disregard the world and despise death, why they reject the Greek gods, the Roman gods, and why they do not worship like the Jews do, even though they worship ostensibly the same God. And also, why do they have such sort of close bonds with each other within their own communities? So this is sort of the outline of this letter. And so I'm going to kind of look at each of these things in turns. So the author begins by explaining the Christian perspective on the Roman gods. And throughout the letter, you see sort of the author here is not just providing information. It is obvious that the intent of this letter is to not only inform, not only to explain, but also to convert. And so the author exhorts Diognetus to become a new person, allow this information to change you in some way. And so he launches into this argument about the Greek and Roman gods. I'm not going to kind of go blow by blow through this text as much as I have some of the other texts that we've looked at. I just want to kind of give you, I suppose, a bird's eye view of the argument being made. The argument against the Greek and Roman gods is fairly similar to some of the things that we see in the Christian canon. So Diognetus is asked to consider the things that the Greeks and Romans refer to as gods. So in 2:2, look at those whom you call and consider to be gods. Well, what are they? Well, they're statues, right? So they are idols. They are objects. They're human-made gods, and they can't see, they can't move, they can't speak. And so this is kind of reminiscent of, even stuff from the Old Testament. Almost sort of like Elijah taunting the prophets of Baal. Your God isn't responding to your sacrifice? Well, he must be away on a journey or something like that. So pointing out that these things that the Greeks and the Romans call gods are actually just statues. And so for the author of Epistle to Diognetus, this sort of puts the non-Christians in an odd position. Like he says in 2:6, for this reason you hate Christians because they do not consider those things to be gods. Like, oh, you're gonna hate the Christians because they don't think that these statues are actual gods? That's a bit silly. The author makes an example of the fact that the Romans would guard closely their statues, their gods that were made out of precious metals and expensive materials, and then leave their other gods, statues made out of clay, outside. So you would have a situation where perhaps in more public areas where vandalism was likely or theft was likely, they would have idols made out of cheaper materials, and inside homes or in more secure locations, inside temples or what have you, there would be the gods that are made out of more expensive materials. And all of that to say, real gods can't be stolen. You have to care and sort of watch after this god that is supposedly your deity. That seems a bit silly. And so the author here makes the point that this actually enslaves you to these gods. And so real Christians, or not real Christians, but Christians aren't enslaved to these fake gods. They serve the real God. And so that's kind of an interesting argument. It's very direct. It's very thought out. And so one thing that we get from this is that at least the author of Epistle to Diognetus, and by extension, one would assume the rest of the Christian communities that he's speaking for as well, they are not acknowledging the Roman gods. And so this is something that Diognetus might have been wondering about. You know, what is the reason why they do not acknowledge the Roman gods? This is a question that Diognetus needs answered for him. And so the Epistle to Diognetus is providing this explanation as to why this should be the case, that the Christians are not, they're not okay with acknowledging the Roman gods as true gods. So next, the author moves to the Jews. So the Jews don't worship these gods either, presumably for much the same reason. That would make sense. But apparently, Diognetus also needs to be informed about why the Christians are not the same as the Jews. Okay. So the author here provides an explanation. Just at the outset, I want to note that the explanation here is not nearly as thorough. The author spends a fair amount of space kind of laying out logically the reasoning for why the Christians cannot acknowledge the Roman gods and how they are actually, in fact, sort of more pious for doing so. I think the arguments about the Jews here kind of, I would say, it gets a little anti-Semitic. Let's just say that. The author here is very dismissive of Jewish practices and doesn't really take the time to go into detail. He just kind of dismisses out of hand the Jews as being foolish and superstitious. So that's just something to be aware of. Kind of an interesting, maybe prioritization of where the very thought out logical argument is and where the sort of less logical and more reactive argument is. And so the author here argues that Jewish sacrifices to the true God are actually just as silly and useless as Greek and Roman sacrifices to fake gods. In 3:5, the author says, "For some offer to those who are not able to have a share in the honor," that is, the Greeks and Romans. So they're offering honor to gods that can't even benefit from that honor. And others, that is the Jews, offer thinking to give to the one having need of nothing. So the idea here is that they're offering sacrifices to God, but God doesn't need anything. So in the author's mind, that's kind of just as ridiculous. To offer sacrifices pointlessly to fake gods is as silly as offering sacrifices, again, pointlessly to the true God. Another point is slightly more founded in some sort of doctrinal basis. So the author here disagrees with basically Jewish application of the law. He says the Jews falsely accuse God as forbidding to do something good on the Sabbath day. And so, to the author's mind, how can this be good if the Jews are portraying God as forbidding doing what is good? And so, sort of a similar thing that we find to that which we find in the Gospels. Is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath? Jesus says yes and affirms this. But a great deal of the language is sort of, the Jews are just superstitious. They're anxious. Their law following is silly, and all of these things. And so there is more than a little sort of anti-Jewish sentiment here. But another thing to notice is the need to very sharply distinguish Christian practice and identity from Jewish practice and identity. And so I think I'm going to devote at least some time later on in this course to sort of talking a little bit more about that, sort of the parting of the ways between Judaism and Christianity, how that happened, what precipitated some of those things. But we see an example of that here. The author of Epistle to Diognetus is very careful to make that distinction so that there is no confusion. Okay. Regarding Christian practice, the author goes on this sort of long litany of descriptions about the lot of the Christians in their Roman context. And a lot of it kind of centers around this idea of the Christians as sort of pilgrims and sojourners, which I would say congrues very cleanly with the language of the Church of Christ temporarily residing at Rome or at Corinth, like we've seen in some of the other early Christian documents that we've looked at. This notion that the church is temporarily in these places and does not have a true home there. And so I'm sort of paraphrasing some of these. The Christians live everywhere but lack their own country. They marry and have children, but they do not expose them. So exposing infants is an ancient practice of infanticide, meaning that if a child was unwanted or defective, families would simply leave them outside to die. So basically a form of abortion, if you want to think of it that way. So, Christians are family people, which is a good Roman pious thing to do, but they do not practice infanticide. They have a common table, but not a common bed. This is probably sort of pushing back against accusations that Christians practiced incest. That was a common, and I'll cover this in a little bit more detail next time, I think, but a common accusation that was leveled against Christians is because they used familial language, brother-sister language, to refer to one another, that then Christians who married within their own community were in incestuous relationships. So if a Christian brother and a Christian sister marry, that was perceived as being incestuous, even though that was in fact not the case. They obey the laws and even surpass them. They love all people and are persecuted by all. They are put to death and are made alive. They are warred upon, and this is a direct quote from 517, they are warred upon by the Jews as foreigners, and they are persecuted by the Greeks, and those who hate them are not able to state the reason for their enmity. So a very sort of comprehensive description, and there's actually a lot more than what I've laid out here. I picked out a few sort of key statements, but there is this sense that Christians have no true home in the world, that they are sort of beset on all sides by various trials and things, and the sense is that they are sort of hyper moral, hyper upright citizens. They're doing well by all people. Later on in section 7, there's a slightly more, I would say, specific reference to persecution. Do you not see them being thrown to beasts so that they might deny the Lord and they are not overcome? Do you not see to the degree that more are punished, the more others increase? These do not seem to be the works of people. These things are a miracle of God. These things are proof of his coming. So, in his words to Diognetus, there seems to be the assumption that there is visible persecution of Christians occurring in some fashion. It's difficult to tell how regular of an occurrence this would be, but there is an assumption that Diognetus has familiarity with Christians being persecuted. Do you not see them being thrown to beasts so that they might deny the Lord and they are not overcome? There is an assumption that Diognetus has familiarity with these situations. There's also the notion that increased persecution brings about increased conversion. And these are sort of signs of divine favor and protection upon the Christian community. And there's a lot of language of God as judge and notions of the coming judgment and things like that, which I'm not going to have time to go into today, I don't think. But all of this is sort of geared at persuasion. As with pretty much any ancient text, there is a rhetorical purpose. And here, the purpose is not only, as I said, to inform Diognetus, but to convert. So I'm paraphrasing again, but the notion here is Diognetus, once you too become a Christian, once you as well become an imitator of God, then you will understand these things. So there are some things that the author of Epistle to Diognetus sort of doesn't really try to explain fully. He sort of presents his case, he presents his reasoning, he presents what he knows, and that material is powerful, but he still sort of says, you'll only truly understand this once you step forward and participate. And so, there's some echoes of things that we saw in the letters of Ignatius of Antioch. The idea that alongside the law, alongside the prophets, alongside the Gospels, we have the testimony of personal suffering. So there's some notion of that present here as well. But here's sort of where the rubber meets the road. Here is where this sort of provides us with a launching off point for sort of our further discussion of persecution and martyrdom. Because despite all of this, despite the fact that Epistle to Diognetus is intended to lay out and elucidate the reasoning behind Christian rejection of the Greek and Roman gods, Christian difference to Jewish practice, the state of sort of Christian attitudes towards the world, there is still no clear reason described for the persecution of Christians. He never says why they are being persecuted. He doesn't say, even though the Christians, even though they are accused of being subversive dissidents, nevertheless they are moral people and they obey the law and they face their trials bravely and stuff like that. There's never the notion of, they refuse to sacrifice to the emperor, they refuse to worship the emperor, they refuse to offer a libation to this or that Roman god, and so they are persecuted, and they don't do that because they think the Roman gods are no gods at all, etc., etc. There's nothing like that. Now, perhaps this is because Diognetus doesn't need this explained to him. Perhaps this would be redundant, but still, it's kind of odd. Now, there is a danger to arguing from what is left out. A lot of times, I would say in sort of some conversations about the synoptic gospels, for example. If, let's say, the Gospel of Luke leaves out something that was in one of the other gospels, there will be speculation as to why. It's really hard to figure out why someone didn't write something. It's easier to figure out why someone did write something. It's harder to figure out why they didn't write something. And so it is difficult to say, why did the writer of the Epistle to Diognetus leave out sort of a more specific notion of why Christians were being persecuted. Perhaps even the simple just notion that a Christian is persecuted for being a Christian is sort of, on the face of it, explanation enough. And that is perfectly possible. In fact, as we'll see, Christians were indeed put on trial for being a Christian. Now, it's a little more complicated than that, and I want to say more about that idea. But regardless, when it comes to Epistle to Diognetus, we are, along with Diognetus, left in the dark. There is no description given about sort of the reasoning why, the why behind early Christian persecution. Now, this general description that we are given matches the other texts that we've looked at. So, suffering as imitation of Christ. We've got that here in Epistle to Diognetus. Refusing to deny Christ. In this previous slide, do you not see them being thrown to beasts so that they might deny the Lord? The purpose of being thrown to the beasts is, in the writer's mind, to get Christians to deny the Lord. That's here. So we've seen that in martyrdom of Polycarp. Also being executed by beasts and or fire. This also congrues with what we've seen in other texts. But it is difficult to take that and then reconstruct the legal and social realities that these texts are responding to. So all of these texts are responding, trying to make sense of social circumstances that the early Christians found themselves in. Epistle to Diognetus is attempting to provide an explanation for not only Christian belief and practice, but in some way provide an explanation for how and why they are responding to persecution in the way that they do. Martyrdom of Polycarp, again, trying to set forth an example of how to respond to martyrdom. Ignatius of Antioch, in some ways giving us a glimpse into kind of his own thinking about martyrdom. But what these texts are not doing is giving us a full description of the context for these responses. I think it's safe to say that these early Christian texts largely focus on the theological significance of early Christian response to persecution. Really, the descriptions of martyrdom and persecution that we've seen are not all that interested in sort of the why behind persecution. There really isn't an attempt to say, oh, well, so-and-so in the town accused Polycarp or whoever of this specific thing, and here's why that was wrong, and here's what happened when Polycarp was put to death anyways. You don't really get that kind of thing. And so there is not really much time spent on the reasons for persecution or the context of that persecution. And so if we sort of limit our understanding of early Christian persecution and martyrdom to the Apostolic Fathers or other early Christian texts, we end up with what is, I would say, a very robust theology of martyrdom. But we end up with not such a great picture of what that persecution actually looked like or what it entailed. We have this vague sense that there are groups of Christians being executed for some crime that somehow involves the fact that they are Christians. And that they are being asked to deny Christ in order to escape punishment. So, all that to say, if we want to gain a better understanding of some of these things, we can't rely on these texts that are very theological in their orientation to then do all of the historical heavy lifting for us. I hope that makes sense. These texts, especially texts that deal primarily with martyrdom stories, are intended to communicate theology about martyrdom, and I would say are not so much intended to give a full historical accounting of that martyrdom. So, very theological in orientation, less so historical. And so, I have this list of questions that I actually had this as I think our last slide last week, but we're left with a lot of questions. What were Christians actually charged with? The Romans were very thorough and methodical in terms of their justice system. Their sort of executive officers had a lot of latitude to sort of use the tools of justice and enact justice in ways that they saw fit. But in terms of just the judicial process, they had that. You couldn't just randomly get a Christian killed by simply reporting them to the authorities. There had to be a trial and an accusation and a public confrontation about it. So, what were they actually charged with? Was there some sort of law outlawing Christianity on the books? Was Christianity illegal in some way? Was there widespread persecution of Christian communities? What did that look like? Were the Romans sort of rounding people up, feeding them to animals? Was this sort of something that everyday Christians could expect to happen to them imminently? And then the issue of voluntary martyrdom. Why did, for example, the martyrdom of Polycarp kind of take time to argue that voluntary martyrdom was not to be sought after? Why was that a problem? What were some of the theological reasons why that would be an issue? So all of these are really important questions. And I think we may actually end up not going quite as long today as we usually do, because I'm trying not to do too much at once. With this lecture, I was originally going to go through all of the historical stuff that we're actually going to do next time. And I kind of realized this is not a good idea. I need to space this out a little bit more. But that's why this episode's titled Questions That Need Answering. We sort of need fulsome answers to these questions if we're going to understand exactly what's going on here. So, as sort of an object lesson, if you will, as to why these questions are so important, I present you with the humble Jesus fish. So you may be familiar with this symbol. This is a Jesus fish, as it is sometimes called in our modern American context. But it's also called an ichthus. And so this is a symbol that does indeed crop up in early Christianity. And you might be familiar with it from things such as the backs of cars. So these sort of metal decals going on the back of cars. Here, this one says in Greek, ichthus, the Greek word for fish. Or you have sort of the genesis of the dueling fish, the Darwin evolution fish, and then its sort of reactive counterpart, the truth fish, swallowing up the Darwin fish. To me, this is sort of a hallmark of like 90s, what would Jesus do era, sort of evangelical culture. Now, why do I bring this up? Well, actually, let me back up. There is an interesting, I think it's safe to call it a myth, or maybe a legend, surrounding the original use of this symbol in early Christianity. So I asked my wife this question earlier today, just to see like what she would say. We have never talked about this before. And I asked her, like, where did that symbol come from? Where did it originate? And what she said was, I think, basically representative of a vague impression that many Christians have, that this ichthus symbol, this fish, was used by the Christians in Rome during either Roman persecution in general or during the persecution of Nero in particular in the first century, as a secret symbol, a secret sign used to identify other Christians, used to mark meeting places and things like this. Christians sort of drawing a fish in the dirt as a way of identifying other Christians. And there was a cartoon in, I guess, probably the 90s called The Story Keepers. And it's this cartoon about these Christians in Rome during the time of Nero, 64 AD. And if you watch just like the intro to one of these episodes, just Google it, find it on YouTube. The intro makes various claims, such as Nero's persecuting Christians, thousands and thousands of Christians. I think it just says thousands. Thousands of Christians are arrested and sold into slavery. It shows Christians using the fish symbol, both drawn on the ground and painted on a building to mark where they are. A sort of underground railroad type of thing. And last night I was thinking to myself, wait, what evidence do we have for this? Just out of curiosity. And I could not find any. I asked an acquaintance on Twitter who's a researcher in early Christian martyrdom to see if he knew of anything. This seems to be a fabrication. This idea that the early Christians used the ichthus symbol as this sort of secret marker. And it's also completely incorrect that thousands of Christians were being sold into slavery. As we'll talk about next time, the actual numbers of Christians actually persecuted and either executed or put on trial by Nero is in the hundreds, not thousands. If you remember back to our table of the growth rate of early Christianity, there would have been about 2,000 Christians in the Roman Empire at this time. The city of Rome is 4 or 5 million people around this time. Anyways, but going back to this, what is the reason why this fish symbol was popular in, I guess, the 80s and 90s? Why were people putting it on their cars? What caused the resurgence in interest in this ancient Christian symbol? And to be clear, the ancient Christians did use the ichthus symbol, but on art and other things. It wasn't, to my knowledge, a secret code or a covert symbol. But for modern Christians, It was a symbol identifying Christians in a hostile cultural context. So you'll see an ichthus on business cards or signs, or the car thing is probably the most popular. But it was this idea that Christians are identifying themselves and kind of have this secret handshake thing in the midst of a culture that is turning against them, that is hostile to them. And so it is then helpful to sort of co-opt this early Christian symbol and use it in the same way, supposedly, that these early Christians did. I found articles in Christianity Today from even as recently as 2008, I think, kind of describing this sort of thing. So my point is that this entire idea, the entire concept of the Jesus fish as subversive symbol, is not based on anything historical. And in fact, it relies upon this sort of fanciful idea of a Nazi Germany-like situation where Christians are in hiding. It's like an underground railroad sort of thing, that there are Roman police chasing innocent Christian bakers through the streets of Rome. That's thousands of people being sold into slavery. That is not a thing. So this is why understanding this stuff is important for us. Because, for one thing, excuse me, religious persecution and oppression is, for better or for worse, a part of our nation's story. The flight of some of the first English settlers from England to North America is, for religious reasons, conflicts with the church in England. Other things, even the formation of many of our black denominations in the United States is, in part, I would say, because of black Christians being forced out of majority white denominations. Things of that nature. And so, in all kinds of ways, the idea of religious oppression is a part of our sort of cultural fabric in the United States. And I think, in some way, the Christian imagination, not only in the United States, but of the whole church, has been shaped by the theologies of persecution and martyrdom that we have inherited from the early church. But the historical context of those theologies actually does make a difference, because we need to understand exactly what those theologies of persecution and martyrdom were responding to if we are going to understand them correctly. And so when what I'm calling the rhetoric of persecution gets brought out, the idea that, in the 80s and 90s, Christians were in the midst of a hostile cultural context, and that the use of this subversive symbol was helpful in some way. That is kind of built on some of this historical stuff. Or, even very recently, in responding and trying to deal with the various restrictions that exist because of the pandemic. The language of, being under the authority of Caesar gets brought up. Should churches obey Caesar or obey God in their view? That is the rhetoric of persecution. And that calls to mind this entire story of Christians in the first couple of centuries of the church's existence. And a lot of times, that historical narrative is not one that is based in reality, and is not one that is really materially connected with these theologies of persecution. in order to understand what these early Christians believe about martyrdom and persecution, we need to understand what they were responding to. So, all that to say, we need to, I would say, read and mark well the theology of the early church, but we also need the historical context that allows us to read it wisely. So it was kind of my intention to show you some of the responses to persecution first, to show you how the early Christians were thinking about some of these things, and then to go over the realities that they were responding to. Because we need to have kind of both pieces of that puzzle. And I think if you do it the other way around, this way it seems a little backwards. Like, why wouldn't we talk about the historical events and historical realities first, and then talk about how the early church responded to those things? But I think this way is helpful. To be honest, the nature of early persecution makes the response of the early church seem a little bit overblown. I'm generalizing there. But the actual reality of persecution was much more limited than we realize. And so it kind of makes some of these things seem like, gosh, you're kind of overreacting. But what we'll see is that the early church, they were applying, I think, very consistently and very thoroughly this notion of imitation of Christ, regardless of what they were responding to. And so I think what we'll find is that when we look at the nature of early persecution, we will find a lot more to relate to when it is considered historically, when we have a realistic view of it. Early persecution was not this grandiose thing. It was largely everyday Christians trying to live their lives, coming into conflict with their neighbors, coming into conflict with their government, but just trying to follow Jesus in the midst of that. Yeah. I'll have a lot more to say about that next time. But all that to say, there are a lot of questions that we still have to answer. And so next time, I think I'm not going to be covering a specific text from the Apostolic Fathers. I'm just going to be walking through kind of the nature of persecution in the Roman Empire. And so we will begin with sort of the first phase of persecution, that is conflicts between the early Christians and the Jewish communities that they were in and around. Then we'll talk about persecution under Nero, and then sort of the nature of everyday sort of normal Christian conflict with the Greco-Roman world until the Decian persecutions about a century and a half later. So that'll be next time. So that'll be a little bit more of a, I would say, a historical-ish session, not so much evaluating the writings of some author, but considering some historical data points that we can use to help us understand why the early Christians responded in the way that we have seen them respond in some of these texts. So that'll be next time. As always, if you have any questions, which you may very well have after today, I will be doing a Q&A episode on Wednesday. I usually do those Wednesday evening, not really at any particular time, but if you would like to send me a question that you'd like me to answer either about anything I've said today or about the New Testament, ecclesial theology in general, I'd be happy to answer those questions. So send me any questions that you have through whatever medium makes sense to you. You can post a comment, message me on Slack, social media, whatever works for you. So that will be next time. And having said that, I think I will leave off there. So peace be with you.